Today we are celebrating Jesus. Sorry, moms. But we are honoring you. And so on Mother's Day, we remember the women who gave us life and also the women who kept us alive. My mom, if you know me well, this will shock you. When I was a kid, I had a problem controlling my mouth. I know I can't believe it either. I've come so far. And so I was always saying stuff that I wouldn't or shouldn't say. And I asked her once, like, Mom, when did that start? And she said, when you started talking. And so she would commonly tell me this story when I was growing up of I was, I think, 3.5, 4 years old. And my sister, who's 18 months older than her and I were out front playing in the front yard. My mom was in the house. Back in the old days where you could do that and not be considered a negligent mother, but now we judge each other for letting our kids play freely. But back then they didn't. So we were outside playing, and suddenly my older sister came running in the house yelling, Mom, 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 come on. And so my mom came out, and little 3.5, 4-year-old me was on the ground with one of the 7-year-old neighbors on top of me with his hands around my neck, and my face was turning blue. And so she went full mama bear and ran him off very, very quickly. And then later, now I have no memory of any of this. She could have made the whole thing up as far as I know to make a point later in life repeatedly on a monthly basis. But she later told me, she said, the reason that happened is you and your sister were playing and this kid rode up on his bike and you just started running your mouth. Like a little 3.5-year-old, just little yappy dog, you wouldn't stop. And he told you to stop and you wouldn't stop. And your sister told you to stop and you wouldn't stop. So finally he decided to stop you by not letting you breathe. And so she would tell me this story all through my teenage, middle school, high school. Every time I would get in trouble for running my mouth, she would tell me, this almost killed you. And one day it might. And so every year on Mother's Day, for my mom, it is a good day for her because it's one more year that my mouth has not killed me yet, right? And so to all of you moms, especially if you've got kind of that mouthy boy that you're just thinking, I don't know if you're going to make it to high school graduation. I just want to encourage you, keep after him because he might be my pastor one day. And I need you to do that, right? So plus, he's a fun kid. Nobody wants a boring kid anyway. So embrace it. Be glad that God has given him to you, okay? We are in the middle of a series of messages, actually nearing the end of these, called Don't Settle, where we're talking about the fullness of life that Jesus has brought to us. The idea for this comes from John chapter 10:10, where Jesus says, the thief comes to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full. And what we've talked about each week is different ways that we are tempted to settle for less than the fullness of life that Jesus offers to us. This doesn't mean that we're not following him. It doesn't mean we haven't surrendered our lives to him. But it means for many of us, in one way or another, we have settled for an experience that is less than life to the full. Right? The life Jesus describes is a life of abundance, where we are not necessarily have every material thing we need, but we have all of his grace and all of his goodness that we need to face every situation that we encounter. And yet the enemy comes, and if he cannot lead us completely away from Christ, he will tempt us to settle for a life of less than the fullness that Jesus offers to us. This morning, I want to talk to us for just a few moments about the temptation we face to settle for a life of comparison. I know many of you, like me, you grew up playing sports, maybe currently you're junior high, high school, college. You are still in that season, and I loved it, right? I loved playing. I loved watching. I loved coaching. And one of my favorite parts of any sporting endeavor is that there's always a scoreboard, right? There is always something that at the end of the game, you can point to it, and you know exactly how you did. Right? Either I won or I lost. And that as a kid and even now as an adult is a satisfying feeling because there's so much of our life where we don't have that final definition of yes, you won, yes, you lost. We're just kind of in this in-between land. And so I've always loved that idea of there's a score, and at the end we know who the winner is and we know who the loser is. Right? Now confined to a basketball court, a baseball diamond, a football field, wherever else, that is a fine and good thing. But when we begin to take that scoreboard life and apply it to every other relationship and every other space, we get into some pretty dangerous ground. And really, we get into a way of living that can cause us to settle for less than the fullness of life Jesus has offered to us. So eventually we get past this point where we're no longer tracking runs or touchdowns or points, and we start to keep score in other ways, with health, with wealth, with our appearance, with our job, with our home, with our car, with our grades, all of these other ways where we're looking around and seeing how we compare to other people. And depending on the results, then we either kind of elevate ourselves up above them or we lower ourselves beneath them. But we're constantly comparing. Moms, on Mother's Day, this is a temptation that you're well aware of, not just for you, but also for your kids. Because you're not just comparing yourself to other people, you're comparing your kids to other people's kids, right? To see how they stack up, right? And so you're looking, how are their grades? How are their activities? How are their clothes? How's their appearance? How are their friends? How do they match up academically? How do they match up socially? How do they match up physically, right? It's why, like when you go to the doctor and they show you where your kid is on the growth chart, for some reason that fills us with an inordinate amount of pride. Like, yes, 95th percentile. We're really doing well. We're accomplishing great things. Our kid is tall. You know, it's just like we find all of these ways to compare and to elevate. And moms, dads, we do the same thing. But you know that comparison of your kids to other kids at its core really isn't even about your kids, right? It's about you. Because if my kid is better than your kid, then I'm better than you. Right? Some of you are brave enough to say it. Others are like, I've never thought that. I only pray for people. You are liars, all of you, right? We all have that. It's in there. But when we settle for this life of comparison, we're setting ourselves up for far less than Jesus offered to us. Right? If you're going to live that scoreboard life, first of all, it's going to poison you. It's going to poison your soul because it means you're going to look around. There are going to be times you feel like, okay, I'm winning, I'm better, and you're going to swell up with pride and you're going to look down on others. And then there are going to be other moments where you look around and you think, okay, now I'm losing. I don't compare. I don't match up, and you're going to shrink down. But either way, whether you are swelling up with pride or you're shrinking away in insecurity, comparison is poisoning your soul. That scoreboard life is depleting too. It will deplete you relationally. It will exhaust all of your family relationships, all of your friendships. Some of us, we've grown up in spaces or we work in places or maybe we live in homes where we know we are always being compared to someone else. And you know how exhausting that is on you to know that for your parent, for your sibling, for your spouse, for your boss, for your coworkers, you're never going to match up to the other person. Right? And when we begin to place that weight on someone else, it doesn't just exhaust our soul, but it exhausts them as well. So that scoreboard life, it'll deplete you relationally. For some of us, it will deplete us financially because we're going to spend to prove that we are winning. No matter how big our mountain of debt has to be, we're going to have the house, we're going to have the car, kids are going to have the clothes, we're going to be in the right places at the right times, we're going to take the right trips so that we can post and everyone can see how beautiful our life is. And then at the end of the month, we're the only ones seeing just how big of a hole we've dug. You can ruin yourself. And we, if we had time, we could go around and tell stories of maybe our own life or those that we love, people who have ruined themselves financially in an effort to prove that they're more important than someone else. And so you'll ruin yourselves relationally, you'll ruin yourselves financially, it'll also deplete you emotionally. It is exhausting when you're living a life of comparison because as soon as you achieve what you thought would satisfy your soul, what do you find? There's something else you have to have. Right? You move out of one neighborhood into the next neighborhood where the homes are a little bigger and you think this will finally be it. And then you start looking around thinking, well, now all my neighbors have nicer cars. Now all my neighbors go on nicer vacations. Now all my neighbors' kids have more fun activities than mine do. And suddenly the thing you thought was going to be the solution to your problem has opened the door to a dozen problems that you couldn't see. Right? We can't settle for this life of comparison. And we also have to understand comparison is going to be a constant temptation for us all through life. You know, and it hits us in different ways. So for some of us, comparison attacks our competitive spirit. Of you just, every time you see something, there's something in you that rises up and you think, I can do better, I can achieve more, I can beat that. For others, comparison will attack your insecurities and your doubts and your inabilities, and it will cause you to shrink away, and you'll think, I'll never be good enough, I'll never match up. But either way, it's going to be a constant temptation. And I think what's helpful for us, because sometimes we start talking about a life of comparison, we think, yeah, it's so hard now in this age of social media. Right? It's so hard now when you can see everybody's highlight reel every night when you're going to bed. And that might be true, but it's also not a new thing. You think of my great-great-grandpa was a Sooner. And so he was, one of those that was out ahead of the legal time to stake your claim here in Oklahoma. Right? And why did he do that? Because he's going to be better than the next guy. Right? He's going to get the better plot of land out in western Oklahoma than the next guy. And so you think of your own family stories. Before your family compared lake houses, they were probably comparing sod houses, right? Of who had the nicest dirt floor, whose walls were built, who had the fewest amount of fleas, right? Like we're always going to compare. Before we compared 401ks, we were comparing how many livestock you own. Before there was cars or horses, there's always something to compare against. It's not new. In fact, if you go all the way back to the story of Jesus and his disciples in Luke chapter 9, you find a story of a strange interaction between the disciples that Jesus speaks very directly to teach us about the dangers of settling for a life of comparison. So we're going to start in Luke 9, verse 46. So kind of the setting here is in the verses just preceding, Jesus has transfigured on the mountain. So he's went up on this mountaintop with Peter, James, and John, and he's had this supernatural experience that has proved to these three men, he's not just another teacher. There is something extraordinary going on here. They come down from the mountain, and a father brings his son who's possessed by an evil spirit. The disciples have prayed and can't help him, and Jesus drives it out with a word. And then as they're walking on from there, Jesus begins to tell the disciples, hey, you guys need to pay attention because I'm going to be handed over to the hands of my enemies. He's beginning to foreshadow his death. And in the midst of these three amazing supernatural things, this is what happens. An argument started among the disciples as to which of them would be the greatest. Right? I mean, now just consider that for a moment. Jesus has transfigured before them. They've witnessed more miracles before this. They've watched him drive out an evil spirit. He's told them, hey guys, I'm going to be handed over to my enemies. Just a little bit before that, Peter has confessed, you're the Messiah, the Son of God. And now their response to all of this, and they're actually walking with Jesus in that moment too. And their response is to argue about which of them will be the greatest. Right now, so sometimes I think we have this idea of if I just get really close to Jesus, then all these problems I have are going to fall away. Well, the disciples are walking with him. They have seen him perform miracles hours before, and they give in to this constant temptation of comparison. All right, so being near Jesus is not going to solve this comparison problem for you. And I've seen this played out. You might have even had this experience in your life where maybe you live or you work in a competitive environment. Or you have some friends, right, who are just constantly, they're the one-uppers telling you, hey, you got to get this, you got to get there, you got to, like that trip you went on is cool, but we did this, and you went for 2 weeks, and we went for 4, and you live here, and so you decide, okay, that's enough. This is poisoning my soul. I'm going to separate myself from that environment. And I'm going to move into a new space where comparison is not going to poison me in the same way it always has. So maybe you go super holy and you cut off all of them and you go to work for a Christian company and you plant yourself in a church and you dive into your home groups and you're serving and you're giving and you're going, you're doing all the things that Christians are supposed to do. And before you know it, you know what happens? You find yourself sitting in someone's home group and they're talking about something fun that they did and you start comparing in your heart. Well, God, why didn't I get to do that? You're sitting in their home and you're looking around and you're thinking, their house is nicer than mine. They don't have any boogers on the wall in here. Right? Like, not that any of us would have that. That'd be gross, right? But sometimes you do. And you're just looking around, you think, this isn't what I thought. They start to talk about their job or their opportunities, and all those same desires come. Why do they come up? You think, I'm closer to Jesus than I've ever been. Why am I still dealing with this stuff? And the reason is because you can't completely solve an internal issue with external fixes. Right? Those changes in environment are going to help you to a point, but until you take care of what's in your heart, it's not going to make a difference. And I know this is true from my own experience. So I've been a pastor here at Christian Chapel for 13 years. And for 13 years, I have been, more than 13, but especially for the last 13, I've been fighting this comparison idea in my own heart. Because I'm a competitive person, right? And if somebody tells me where they are, I want to know exactly where I stack up. And if I'm below, I want to get above. And so for 13 years, I've been going to ministers' meetings. I've been going to conferences. I've been going to all of these different little committees that I serve on, things like that. And walking into those spaces, I mean, these are pastors. These are men and women who, like, their job is to read the Bible, to pray, to study the Scripture, to make a difference for Jesus in the world. And I walk into those spaces where I should have more in common and be more safe and more secure in who I'm called to be and what I'm called to do. And yet, as soon as those conversations start of, hey, so how big's that church you pastor? How many people are on staff with you? Now, these can be innocuous questions. Or, for somebody weak like me, they can be triggers of, all right, competition mode. How big's the church? Let's see. If I add up everybody who went all last year and I just say that number, that's not lying, right? They don't mean like average attendance. They just mean everybody who's maybe ever driven by Christian Chapel. 20,000. That's all of these things start to come up. Now, my mom spanked me enough that I know not to say them anymore, but they're still there. Right? And so what I'm learning, and what you've probably learned from your experience, what we see from the disciples, is proximity to Jesus is not enough. It's not enough to be close to Him. It's not enough to try to be like Him. But we have to continually surrender to His Spirit, His power, living inside of us. Because if we're close to Him, we're going to just try to let Him be our role model. But if we'll open our hearts and say, God, there's stuff in here that I can't handle, that I can't get rid of, then His Spirit can go deep and begin to push up and push out all of those things. So being near to Jesus isn't going to take care of it. The other thing you have to be aware of is that life of comparison is going to keep you from doing the things that really matter. Now, again, the disciples, they've seen so many amazing things. There is so much work to be done. They don't fully understand what Jesus has just told them about being handed over to His enemies, and yet their response is to argue about who's the greatest. Is it Peter, James, and John because they got to go up on the mountain? Is it Peter because he's the first one to confess that Jesus is Lord? I mean, we know it's not Judas. Like, he's definitely number 12. But then the rest of them, 1 through 11, how do we rank and where do we, and it's just this, what are we going to do? But in doing so, they have completely lost sight of the fact that they are walking with Jesus. That they are walking on mission with Him. That He has all the power of heaven and earth in His hands. And instead of having that goofy, who is the greatest, they should be focused on, Lord, what do you have for us to do? It's a great reminder for us as well that when we begin to compare with other people and where do I stack up? Am I above? Am I equal? Am I below? As we begin to look out at what others have, we will lose sight of what we have, and not just what we have, but what God has entrusted to us. And if you weren't here last week, you can go back and listen. We talked about the importance of understanding that the small things are big things. Big things are small things, because all things are God's things. So whatever He's put in your hand right now, that's what He's expecting you to be faithful with. And one of the quickest ways to be a poor steward of what God has given to you is to start competing and comparing with others. To start looking and say, well, what have they got? What are they doing? What has she been given? What does she have? And so as we begin to focus on what God has given to us, then we begin to lose some of that desire for comparison. This story finishes with Jesus giving us 2 quick ideas about how we can kill comparison in our lives. He says in verse 47, Jesus, knowing their thoughts, right, which for the disciples, you've got to cut them some slack here. if you followed a leader who knew what you were thinking all the time, there'd probably be a lot of negative stories written about you too, right? I mean, I know there would be me. And then Chris thought this because he's an idiot. Like there are just all of these types of stories. But it says Jesus, knowing their thoughts, took a little child and had him stand beside him. Then he said to them, whoever welcomes this little child in my name welcomes me, and whoever welcomes me welcomes the one who sent me. For whoever is least among you all is the greatest. Now, we live in a kid-centric culture, so we don't understand exactly what's happening here. But in Jesus' culture, kids were important if they were yours, like your son, your daughter, but even then, they were to be seen, not heard. They were to kind of wait. It was a male-dominated society, and children were shoved to the back. And so for Jesus to stop this group of men, this group of leaders, and to bring a child and to say, when you welcome this child, you welcome me. Jesus is teaching them, look, I'm your leader, I'm your teacher, I'm your rabbi. You've confessed that I'm the Son of God, the Messiah. And so you have me up here. And what I'm telling you is you see this little child down here, but when you welcome him, it's as if you welcome me. And Jesus is teaching us that one of the ways we kill comparison in our hearts is by embracing this idea of equality. That in God's eyes, the highest and the lowest are equal. And so all arguments about who's the best, who's the greatest, where do we fit in the pyramid, Jesus is telling us, no, these are worthless ideas. You are all equal in my sight. If I'm telling you that it's just as important to welcome a child as it is to welcome me, then surely you are smart enough to make the connection and understand that you are all equal. You cannot elevate yourself one above the other. And this is where comparison becomes sinful for many of us. It's one thing to acknowledge that there are differences, but it's another thing to let those differences become divisions, where we either swell up and place ourselves over the top of others, or we shrink down and place ourselves underneath others. Because Jesus is very clear. He has come not only to restore our relationship with God, but also to restore our relationship with each other. And our relationship with each other is one of equality. We are brothers and we are sisters, which means that there is no room left for ungodly competition, ungodly comparison between us. Doesn't mean we're not going to have role models. It doesn't mean there aren't going to be people that lead us or that we follow. But what it means is in God's sight, we are equal. And so for me and for you, one of the ways we start letting Jesus dig deep and push up and push out comparison is by asking him to continually teach us, continually remind us that we are equal. Those that we think we're better than, we're equal with. Those that we think we're less than, we're equal with. And so we still show respect, we still show love, we still show acceptance, but we do all of that rooted in a heart that understands we are equal. This would have been a shocking statement for the disciples to hear. They would have just walked by that child. And you can see in other interactions they have with Jesus in the Scripture, he comes back to this idea of welcoming children as a sign of the kingdom. Of welcoming women, of welcoming the sick, the sinner. Everyone who their society has said is lower or is cast out, Jesus goes out of his way to embrace and to include. And for you and I, one of the ways that we not only kill comparison in our hearts, but that we kill comparison in our culture is by sharing that message of in God's eyes, we are equal. Regardless of how much money you make, regardless of your skin color, regardless of your education, regardless of your political affiliation, in God's eyes, we are equal. And especially when we have surrendered to Christ, we are brothers and we are sisters. And we're brothers and sisters from a healthy family, right? Not from one of those families that's defined by weird sibling rivalries and all this kind of backroom maneuvering. No. We are loving and encouraging brothers and sisters. The disciples are slow, and they don't get it. Now, here's what I love. So Luke is writing this story. And Luke throws John under the bus. And so you wonder, even when Luke's writing this, is this just one last chance of maybe just a little bit? Verse 49, Luke quotes John. Master, John said. I mean, Luke could have said one of the disciples, but he doesn't. He calls him out. Like, hey, John's going to write his letter. He can say what he wants. In mine, I'm calling him by name. Master, John said. We saw someone driving out demons in your name, and we tried to stop him because he is not one of us. Do not stop him, Jesus said, for whoever is not against you is for you. Right? Comparison perverts your vision and causes you to see people who are with you as those who are against you. Comparison turns friends into enemies. It turns coworkers into competitors. Turns families into factions. It just poisons all of these. And so the disciples, Jesus has told them, you're equal. And they say, okay, we're equal. But that guy, he's not one of us. He's over there. Can you believe it, Jesus? He's driving out evil spirits. And he's not even one of us. And Jesus, of course, responds how we think he would. Well, he's doing good. He's doing kingdom things. So not only should you let him do those things, but you should celebrate those things. And one of the ways that we fight comparison in our hearts is by learning to authentically celebrate what God is doing through other people. Right? And not just now we're Tulsa, we're kind of that Midwest, South kind of people. Which means we've been taught our whole life that no matter what you think, you smile and say nice things, right? Yes, ma'am, no, ma'am. Oh, that baby's cute. This is what we do. We don't say what we think. We say what you know you want to hear. This is not what Jesus is teaching us. He's not teaching us to kill comparison by becoming superficial. Right? He's not teaching us to kill comparison by learning to click like. He's teaching us you kill comparison by learning you are equal and anyone who is doing God's kingdom work is worthy of being celebrated. Right? Any mother who's loving her child is worth being celebrated. It doesn't matter what you think of how she's doing it. It doesn't matter if her kid's an A student, but he's living on processed foods and refined sugars. You can just celebrate the good things God is doing. Right? Because here's what we do. Like, well, yeah, he is, but he's probably going to die by the time he's 21. He won't even finish that college scholarship because he'll get all kinds of... it's in there. Maybe not for you, but some people. Right? Authentic celebration, though, goes back to this idea of we are brothers and we are sisters. And for those of you who have healthy sibling relationships, your response when good things happen to them is one of joy. But it's one of happiness. It's one of celebration. It's one of, that is so incredible. I'm so amazed. I'm so happy that God is doing those things for you. And Jesus is teaching us all through the scriptures, when we are brought into his kingdom, we are not just subjects and citizens, but we are family. And so we're going to celebrate those who are older than us as if they were our own mothers and fathers. We're going to celebrate those who are near to us as if they were our own brothers and sisters. We're going to celebrate those who are younger than us as if they were our own sons and daughters. For every parent who loves their child, when a good thing happens to your child, a healthy parent does not respond. Like if their kid does something cool in second grade, a healthy parent doesn't say, well, let me tell you about what I did in second grade. It was way cooler than that. And I didn't even have an iPad for the project. And you don't do that. You're just happy. You're thrilled. Why? Because your heart is full of love towards that child. And so what it means when we find ourselves stuck in this comparison game is that our hearts have not yet been fully won over to this new kingdom vision. Right? So again, you want to go back for me, I'll tell you my problems, okay? So I go to these pastors' conferences. And it's really easy for me to celebrate with guys that pastor churches in Lawton, in Oklahoma City, in Ardmore, in Bartlesville, in Ponca City. in Okmulgee, in Porham, in every Pawhuska, in every little place that I've never been to, celebrate all day long. My friends in Tulsa who pastor churches tell me how good things are. I mean, just, as long as we're being honest. Well, suddenly then it rises up again. Well, sure you had that many on Easter. I know what you spent on your marketing budget, and we gave that money to missions. Right? Now, I know this is just me. You don't fight this the way I do. But the only way I have found in the last 13 years that actually brings victory into that battle is by when that thought comes up, not just suppressing it and moving on, but saying, Lord, there is stuff in me that is still messed up. So will you please sow the fruit of your Spirit deep into my heart? Will you cause your love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness? Will you cause those to grow up and push out this desire for comparison and this desire to compete? Will you help me to see my buddies pastoring in Tulsa as my brothers? That I would celebrate them the same way I would my own brother? Will you help me, Lord, to see them that way? Will you help me to move from, hey, good for you, to a celebration of the soul? That this is good when people are doing things for the kingdom. And it doesn't matter how they compare. It doesn't matter how they match up. God, can you just do that? So my prayer for each of us this morning is that we will not settle for a life of comparison. And just don't settle for it. Moms, God gave you your kids, not their kids. So just focus on yours. Celebrate with yours. Right? And I know for Mother's Day, sometimes it's a difficult idea too for some of us, because it's like the thing I want most is to be a mom, and I haven't yet. Or it brings up pain of broken relationships with your kids, and it can turn a day like this into an opportunity for comparison. Or even some of you moms with super healthy marriages, relationships with your kids, everything's going well. For some of you tonight, you're going to lay down at the end of the night, and maybe your husband took you to lunch, your kids gave you some gifts, there's a homemade card, and yet as soon as you start scrolling through Instagram or Facebook, guess what you're going to see? A more thoughtful husband, more loving children, a better gift than what you got, right? A better card. Some wife who her husband took her to Hawaii for Mother's Day. Like, who does that? Somebody did. Some woman's going to get jewelry, and you're going to get a macaroni necklace from your 3-year-old. And in that moment, what are you going to do? You're going to let those old desires rise up? You're going to either begin to raise up in competitiveness and say, well, she got that, but in all these other ways, I'm better than her? You're going to shrivel down into insecurity and think, yeah, I guess it's true. My kids don't love me as much. My husband's not as good. Sometimes that might be true. Like, you might be like my wife. You just got to learn to live with disappointment, right? This is just the way life works. But hey, just stop comparing. Jesus is teaching us, look, you just turn your eyes off yourself. At its core, comparison is all about selfishness. It's all about a me-centered view of the world. That song we sang earlier, I think, is such a great reminder for us when we're tempted to compare. Great are you, Lord. And as we begin to turn our attention up to see who God is and what He's accomplishing, in all these ways we're tempted to compete, to compare, to measure ourselves up against one another. They begin to fade into the background. See, we can easily kind of sit here and make fun of the disciples and think, man, if I walked with Jesus, I wouldn't have done that. And yet we do the same thing. He offers us the power of His Spirit, and we settle for this life of comparison. He offers to push up and push out, and we settle for a life of just managing those behaviors. He offers the opportunity to view others as our brothers and sisters, to embrace them in joyful celebration. And we settle for a life of just not hating them. right? Don't settle for less than what Jesus has come to offer to you. And as you begin to surrender to the power of His Spirit, He will come and He will push up and push out those behaviors. And as you begin to step away from comparison, not only will you experience freedom in your soul, but you'll bring freedom into your relationships. You'll bring freedom into your home. You'll bring freedom into your workplace, into your school, into your team, into every area you go. Freedom will come because you now no longer see everyone else as your competition that must be defeated, but you see them as your brothers and sisters who must be embraced, who must be celebrated, and you can enjoy the good things the Lord is doing. If you'll bow your heads, I want to pray with you. The band's going to come and lead us in a final song. Lord, you see each one of our hearts this morning. You see the way we're wired. You see the struggles that we have. And Lord, I pray for those who are here today whose hearts are just so tempted by comparison. Lord, I pray for those of us who tend to just kind of bow up in a competitive spirit to try to prove our worth over others. Lord, to us, may you bring humility this morning. May you help us to understand that every good thing we have has come from your hand. Not for our fame, but for yours. And pray for those, Lord, for whom comparison tends to make them shrink and shrivel, to shy away from what you've called them to do and who you've called them to be. Those for whom comparison makes them feel weak, inadequate, and insufficient. And I ask this morning, Lord, that you would begin to lift up their heads. They would understand the value of who they are because they are your son or they are your daughter. They would understand the significance of what you have called them to do because it is you who has placed it in their hands. And for each one of us, Lord, whatever side of that spectrum we're on, we ask for your Spirit to come. Work deep in our hearts, Lord. Give us the ability to celebrate each other, to embrace each other, and to let your Spirit push up and push out these issues. We ask it in Jesus' name. Amen. If you'll stand with us, the band's going to lead us in that new song they introduced to us this morning. It's a description of our new identity as God's children. So let's sing it as a statement of faith and as a prayer for Him to make that our experience today.